Just get your...
Yeah, I'm going to put it up now.
First YouTube live.
Go back to YouTube.
Can you do it at IG live on my phone? Where's my phone?
Yep.
You can do it.
Yeah. Oh, you're live.
I'm live? I'm live. Okay. Awesome. Hello, everyone. We are live. Sorry for the slow start. This is our first ever YouTube live presenting one of these things, but thank you so much for tuning in, those who are live. I have Mr. 2.0 here with me, so if any questions do come through, Al, you are going to let me know, aren't you, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, fantastic. We are here to talk about how to crush, actually, the 2025 CrossFit season. The idea of this YouTube live is to talk you through some general principles that we like to follow when it comes to preparing athletes for a competition season. And the good thing about CrossFit is that we have a very definitive CrossFit season. Our CrossFit season, for the vast majority of us, starts and finishes with the CrossFit Open or the CrossFit quarterfinals, or for those who make it, the semi-finals, of course, those who progress to CrossFit Games. Now, yes, one could argue that there are other competitions that happen throughout the year. However, when it comes to building a training program, especially in a group training program, we have to always cater to the masses, the majority of people who follow our program. So for us, we pick the CrossFit Open, the quarterfinals and semifinals as our peaking strategy. So what that means is that how are we going to get our athletes to be at their physical and mental best by the time the CrossFit Open, quarterfinals and semifinals rolls around? Before I continue, Al, we're all good on questions coming in. All good on questions coming in.
Okay.
Yeah, just keep an eye out. Okay, if you do have questions, guys, pop them down below, submit them, and at the end of this call, there will be a chance for Q&As. So yeah, just keep your questions coming in. Okay, let's talk about what we have coming up in this presentation.
Hang on. Keep
The
chatting.
first thing we're going to talk about is what have we learned from the 2024 CrossFit season, which has just ended just now. We're officially going to say, for the vast majority of us, the end of the quarterfinals signifies the end of the 2024 season. The next thing we're going to talk about, Al, is going to be, from what we have learned, what are we going to change for next season? So definitely a few things that we've identified as a programming team that happened this year that was definitely a bit different to years past. And what are we going to take from that in terms of how we program and prepare our athletes for the 2025 CrossFit Open? Next, we're going to talk about how we are going to be breaking up the next 12 months for those who follow the process programming CrossFit program. So just a quick introduction. We have 4 training programs who are training within the sport of CrossFit. We have the Live program, the Perform program, Compete program, and the Elite program. So we're going to talk a little bit about training cycles. We have 4 to 5 different types of training cycles within the year. And we're going to talk about how we break up the year within those training cycles and why we think that's really important versus the kind of constantly varied approach to programming, which a lot of other CrossFit organizations use. We're then going to talk about the 2025 process programming roadmap. So we have already mapped out what the next 12 months is going to look like. We've broken that into lots of different training cycles, and we're going to talk you guys through each one of those training cycles and just a rough idea of what our year is going to look like and how that is going to allow us to end up being really damn fit by the time the CrossFit Open rolls around. And lastly, very quickly, we're going to break down our next training cycle. Our next training cycle is starting next Monday on the 29th of May. And we're going to give you guys a bit of run through as to what to expect and what we have coming up and why we have programmed the way we have. So as I said, if you have questions, thoughts, things that jump into your mind as you're watching here, guys, feel free to pop it in and we will answer at the end here. Okay, moving on. Okay. What did we learn from the 2024 CrossFit season? Okay, let's start with the CrossFit Open first. I think some general takeaways that I think most of us will agree on here. Firstly, in listening to Adrian Bosman and the CrossFit podcast, I listen to a lot of these podcasts because I think it's really important. I find it very helpful, firstly, to kind of get a bit of an insight into how the people who program for our sport think. And what I really love about guys like Bosman and the guys on those podcasts is they share very openly about what they think and what they're doing. So it sounds like the 25% qualifiers to the quarterfinals is going to be something that's here to stay. Personally, we really liked it. I love that it became a lot more inclusive this year. I love that in our affiliates, it allowed a lot more people to kind of progress to the next stage and made it a little bit less kind of elitist. And I love the idea of the programming catering to that entire 25% and even be able to be put into an affiliate model. So for me, I'm a big fan and I'm glad to hear that something's going to stay. So if you are or you were a top 25% athlete, you now have some rough ideas as to what it's going to take in order to allow you to compete and make it to the quarterfinals each year. Now, the tough thing is we only have 3 tests, and those 3 tests can change and vary greatly in nature. So let's not read too much into it. If you crack the top 25%, and you're around the bubble, and what I'd say by that is you finish between 50 to 25%. I would say that it's not an absolute guarantee that you will make it every single year, but at least we have a slightly rough idea as to what it's going to take to make it to the top 25%. And for those who fell outside the top 25%, and if that's your goal to make it to the quarterfinals, perhaps this year is giving you a bit of an indication as to what you kind of need to work on. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have a better idea as to what you need to work on. So what else did we learn from the CrossFit Open tests? Definitely a lot more inclusive this year. When we say inclusive, what we mean by that is a much greater percentage of the population who's registered for the CrossFit Open was actually able to take part in the RX tests. And that is what we mean by inclusivity. There was definitely much more of a conditioning bias. When we look at our 3 workouts, they were 3 hard metabolic conditioning sessions. What I would say about the 3rd test, which was technically like our more strength test, where we saw a heavier barbell with the thruster programmed, it's still very much favored the aerobically conditioned athlete. Which, what I mean by that is in years past, there were tests where you could just be really strong and have maybe an aerobic system that wasn't so well developed and still score really high in some workouts. So when we saw things like a part A, where it was a max lift or just isolated strength tests, we haven't seen that this year. And listening to Adrian Bosman on some of his podcasts, it sounds like he is leaning towards moving away from that style of test where, a strong athlete can potentially max out on points on the leaderboard and really just distort the leaderboard for everyone else. So, that's something we definitely observed. Lower complexity gymnastics and weightlifting, for sure. We didn't see, big variations or like heavy variations or high rep variations of the snatches and clean jerks. In fact, we didn't see any of that with the barbell in the open. And from a gymnastics standpoint, really only had one workout, the final workout with the chest to bars and bar muscle ups that had higher levels of complexity. That said, double unders, a lot can argue, is a somewhat complex movement that seems like it's there to stay. And that did prove once again to be quite a big bottleneck for a lot of people doing the CrossFit Open. So work on your double unders, guys. Backloaded gymnastics complexity. So what that means is that, and this is a theme we saw both in the Open and the quarterfinals, in years past, we have seen things like, if you remember last year, the very first workout, the CrossFit Open, we had 20 ring muscle ups in the first workout. Now, what we're seeing now is that a lot of the gymnastics this year was placed at the end of the workout. So what that meant was at the start of the workout, so the first half or the first 75% of the workout, very inclusive, lots of people could take part. A lot of work had to be done before that really challenging hard workout came out. So what that means is that we saw a lot of people progress the top 25% who weren't able to hit many of those high complexity movements. So what this is potentially leaning towards is, if you're really aerobically fit and you have the basic skills down in the CrossFit Open, that might be enough to allow you to actually progress the next round, even if you didn't have things like handstand walking, bar muscle ups, ring muscle ups unlocked. So that's a good learning curve for us. No isolated strength test this year. Said that already. And majority of our strength was tested in a metabolic conditioning setting. Let's move on. Let's talk about the quarterfinals. Now, quarterfinals is something that's only been around for a few years, so we don't have anywhere near as much data with the quarterfinals as we do with something like the CrossFit Open. But in comparing this year's quarterfinals with the last few quarterfinals, a few kind of pretty stark changes to this year's quarters. Number one, saw 4 tests, not 5. So what that means is that generally speaking, the volume was a little bit less. And I'd say also in the nature of the tests were not as hard on the body as years past. Yes, that second workout, the wall balls, burpee box jump overs was a tough one, but it didn't have like the heavy compounding effect on the body. Because we have a bigger time window now, that means there's less need for athletes taking part in the quarterfinals to do multiple sessions in a day. So in years past, we prepared people to be ready to have to do 1, 2, maybe even 3 workouts in a day because the bigger time window now, I think it's quite nice. A lot of people who qualify to quarterfinals, who maybe train, in our Live, Perform, Compete programs or in affiliates, aren't used to training multiple times a day, and they probably don't have the time in their schedule to do that. So I do like the quarterfinals means that you guys don't have to do any special preparation for the quarters in terms of changing up your schedules. Definitely more inclusive tests. I think we can all agree that last year quarterfinals there were tests where you were either strong enough to lift the weight or do the movement, and if you weren't, then it meant you weren't really doing a workout. Whereas this year, I think for all ability levels, pretty much everyone within that 25% was able to take part and get a good workout on all 4 of the tests. So that's fantastic. There's a lot of movements, a lot of complexity. It still hasn't been tested in the open and quarterfinals, in the 7 tests that we've seen. So my thinking now is that, we're probably going to see that come up in the semifinals, and those really heavy style tests are going to be saved for the 0.01% of athletes who actually make it to that next stage. Similar to the CrossFit Open, backloaded difficulty challenge. So what I mean by that is if we think about workout 3 in the quarterfinals with the complexity of the ring muscle ups and the wall facing handstand push-ups, there was a lot of work that had to be done before that to get there, meaning you can still have a great workout, meaning you can still be somewhat competitive in the quarterfinals and still not be very highly proficient in the more complex movements like ring muscle ups or maybe something like handstand walking. Similarly, our strength test workout 4, it did get heavy, but for the elite athletes, it's still, for a lot of these guys, between kind of like 70 to 85% of their 1 rep maxes. The heaviness came later in the workout. I'll talk about what this actually means from a program standpoint. Definitely more of a conditioning bias. When we look at now the quarterfinals and the CrossFit Open, you got 7 tests there, and we really only saw 1 workout of the 7 be a heavier test, and still you had to be very aerobically fit to excel in that workout. Lower complexity gymnastics in general, there was no isolated strength test. As I said, listen to Adrian Bosman on the podcast. Sounds like that's something he might be moving away from. And instead of having isolated strength tests, our strength was tested in a metabolic conditioning session test. Okay, so this is the important part. Having seen the 2024 season roll out now, what are we going to change for the 2025 CrossFit season? So what I will say before this is I think we did a lot of things as an organization that's preparing athletes for the Open and the quarterfinals. I think we did a lot of things really, really well. And there's a lot of things that, in fact, we're probably not going to change. We're going to keep as is. In terms of how many athletes we actually had qualified to the next rounds within our affiliates and our online programs, I think it's testament to the fact that we did probably something right. With that said, there's always opportunities for learning. And as the sport changes, it's important that people who are programming in the sport have to keep up with those changes to make sure that next year we are preparing athletes to the best of our ability. With that said, we also can't look too much into 1 year of testing. It's much easier to make solid assumptions when you see consistencies year on year. But we've had 3 quarterfinals now. We've had 3 very different variations of it. I think we've had 3 or 4 opens, which have just been 3 weeks. And again, it's still changing a lot. So we're basically taking the things we've seen this year with a bit of a pinch of salt. We're going to make some assumptions for next year, but we're not going to throw all our eggs in one basket and start programming the way that this season rolled out just because it's what happened this season. So if you're also a coach and you're doing that, or you're an athlete who's programming for yourself, or you're wondering what we're going to do about it, just keep that in mind. So I think just some major changes that we're going to do in terms of preparing our athletes for the Open quarterfinals is really going to happen around the January time. So I'm going to take you guys in just a second how we're actually going to map out our entire year. But typically the January window, so we come out of the new year, is typically when we start to kind of crank things up. Now, in CrossFit Opens in the past, talking 3-4+ years ago, a lot of our training in the preseason would be a little bit more strength biased, a bit more aerobic foundations, so like longer, slower pieces, still doing both those things, working on our gymnastics in more isolated settings. And then usually when January rolled around, because the Open used to be very, very aerobic, we would kind of like crank down hard into hard energy system style training. So like really hard metcons, a little bit more consistently throughout the week. But in the last few years, with strength becoming more of an element to it, how we have biased our training has been maybe to not go so hard on the conditioning stuff in January and still kind of focus a lot more on just maintaining it or continuing to improve our strength a little bit. And then a few weeks before the Open, kind of start to crank things up. Now, for those who target maybe the quarterfinals and the semifinals, so kind of if you're like a top 1 to 5% athlete, or there's a high likelihood you're going to move to semifinals, then that's still going to stay the same. We don't want to start, putting our foot on the gas with our energy system training too early on, because doing too much hard conditioning work too soon can really wear an athlete out. So by the time they get to quarters and semis, they might be burnt out. So we don't want to do that. But for those who are preparing for the Open and maybe wanting to qualify in the top 25%, something we're definitely going to do next year is when January rolls around, we're going to put a bigger emphasis on metcons in our training. And our metcons, from what we've seen this year, are going to be a little bit lower complexity, and it's going to be a lot more kind of pedal to the metal, really pushing hard and making sure we're exposing ourselves to that level of intensity. That said, it doesn't mean that we're not going to do the more complex, the heavy stuff. I still think that stuff's really important. And, as a CrossFitter, you've got to be good at everything. But we're just saying probably going to be a little bit more of a bias with that with our training. In terms of preparing our athletes for the strength tests that might come up next year, it's looking like in the Open and quarterfinals, we're going to see a little bit more of, like heavier lifts, heavier barbells tested under higher levels of aerobic fatigue. So rather than in years past, 30 minutes to build to a heavy single or a max or a total, this is going to be kind of like we see this year, like, ascending loads, weights going up, or having to hit higher percentage of lifts in a combination of gymnastics and monostructural exercise. I think we need to do probably a little bit more of that in our preparation. I think in the last year, I definitely put a bit more emphasis on developing strength in more of an isolated setting, and only added the fatigue-based lifting a little bit closer to the competitive season. I think giving our athletes a little bit more exposure to that kind of stuff a little bit earlier on is going to serve us really well by the time competition rolls around. So I think that goes to my last point in terms of, less isolated strength at the start of January. But before all of January, the focus is very much going to be remaining the same. We think about where we're at right now in the season. The season is just finished. Enter into our very first cycle of the year. This is all about building foundations, which means that our training right now, guys, shouldn't be looking like any of the things I've been talking about. If your training is looking like the workouts of the CrossFit Open, the quarterfinals, right now, I'm going to say, you're getting a little bit too excited too soon. You have 12 months ahead of you. If you get into really, really hard, painful training now, it's going to be very hard for you to sustain. There's going to be a much greater likelihood of things like injury and burnout. And one of our biggest goals at Process Programming is not only to get athletes to qualify to these competitions, to unlock their highest levels of performance, but we want to do so while keeping athletes healthy and helping them to be able to do this for multiple years into the future. That's really, really important. Okay, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about training cycles. So, interestingly, I've seen a few videos of, I guess we can call them influential characters or influential coaches or figures within the CrossFit industry who've recently been talking about this idea of periodization. And like, is periodization needed in CrossFit? And there has been some ideas around, it's actually not needed. Instead, we should just be keeping really fit all year round. so that we are, prepared for anything. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think it's an important conversation to have, that if your goal is to prepare for a very specific time within a year, whether it's a competition, in this case, we're talking about the Open, the quarterfinals, or any other sport. Let's say it's a match you're preparing for, or it's a race that you're preparing for, or it's an event that you want to be at your fitness for. In my opinion, there has to be the program leading up until that point has to prepare the athlete for that. So it needs to slowly get a little bit more intense, needs to get a little bit more challenging, and the training over the year needs to look more and more like the actual competition by the time you arrive there. And we need to be able to do that in a way that also keeps the athlete healthy, keeps the athlete improving, and it has to be fun and engaging in the process. So it is a really challenging thing to balance all three of those things. So we always talk about, so before I get into how we're going to lay out the next 12 months, I think it's important that we talk about the different training cycles that we might see within not just a CrossFit program, but any training program for any sport. So in no particular order, but the reason it's called phase one, I'm going to take you through phase two, phase three, phase four, is this is a general kind of flow. If you imagine phase one is the start of the year and we're moving towards competition time. So phase one, forget the word phase one. Let's think more about this idea of accumulation. When we're doing an accumulation cycle, which you might have heard, and if you've been a part of the process program for some time, you definitely would have seen this before. But generally speaking, we are isolating our movements a little bit more versus kind of mixing them in with other movements under fatigue. We're doing a lot more skill and technique focus. With our strength training, we're doing much more kind of big, strong compound lifts, but we're also doing a lot more accessory style movements. So bodybuilding, single arm, single limb work, structural balance work. When it comes to conditioning work, we're thinking a little bit less about doing really short, very hard workouts like we might see in the CrossFit Open. And we're thinking a little bit more about lower intensity, slower pace, building a big foundation with our aerobic capacity. And if we can do both those things with strengthening and conditioning, building a foundation, think about the bigger the base you build, the taller the building we can build. Or what I mean by that in the CrossFit setting is that the bigger the foundation we can build in our off season, the more it's going to prepare us to be able to do shorter, harder, more intense efforts later on in the year. And it's going to keep us healthy in the process. So generally speaking, in an accumulation cycle, our intensity is a little bit lower. In terms of health versus performance, we're kind of probably lean a little bit more on the health side right now. So we're about to go into an accumulation side. If we think about what we just come out of, we just come out of a competition phase. Well, generally speaking, in competition phases where we're pushing really hard with our training, we're doing things that we probably wouldn't normally do. There's a higher likelihood of things like injuries, burnouts, picking up little niggles. So in accumulation phases, great chance for us to kind of heal and recover from all those things. The next thing you might hear us talk about is intensification. And intensification is almost kind of self-explanatory. It's more intense phases of training. And when we're talking about intense in the sport of CrossFit, we're thinking about our Metcons are a little bit more intense. So we're going maybe a little bit shorter in duration, a little bit higher in intensity. When we think about our weightlifting, we're thinking about higher intensity. So lower rep schemes, working closer to our 1 rep maxes. When we're talking about things like gymnastics and skills, maybe we're going to do less isolating our gymnastics and skills, and we're going to try throw them into some workouts. Like if we can do muscle ups in isolation, what happens if we throw muscle ups with double unders and squat snatches, as an example? So generally speaking, in intensification cycles, in CrossFit, our training looks a little bit more like the sport. So our training is going to look a little bit more like the CrossFit Open. Whereas in accumulation phases, it's going to look a lot less like the CrossFit Open. Other phases that we do in CrossFit is a competition prep phase. So this is the period of time before a competition. So how we like to break this up, or when we start our competition preparation phases, is typically anywhere between 2 to 8 weeks before the competition. This is where our training really starts to look like the competition. So things like if the competition is going to take place on a Saturday, like the CrossFit Open, We want to make sure in our competition prep phase, we're doing our hardest sessions on a Saturday. And the workouts on a Saturday are going to look like the workouts that we might do in the CrossFit Open. So we're really preparing ourselves both physically and mentally for those tests. And then, of course, we have the competition season or the competition cycle or phase. This is when we're actually just competing. So the CrossFit Open, it's 3 weeks of a competition cycle. The quarterfinals is 6 days of a competition cycle. And when you're in a competition cycle, the focus really is about allocating as many of our resources, as much of our energy towards just doing the competition, which means that training is no longer really a priority. Training is just there, keep us healthy, keep us moving along, keeping us physically and mentally sharp so that we can crush the competition. And then the last phase or phases that we talk about is a deload or a taper. Now, these are two terms that more or less mean the same things. But when we talk about deloads are something that we're going to have kind of periodically scheduled throughout our year. So within each big training cycle of, let's say, 8 weeks, we may see 1 to 2 deloads within that 8 weeks. And a deload is just an opportunity for us to rest, recover, regenerate from the training that we've been doing. And that's really where all the adaptations take place. A little reminder on that, if you're doing a 6-week training cycle and each week you're making your training harder and harder and harder, remember that you're not actually getting fitter and stronger each week that you're adding that. In fact, your body is getting more and more burnt out, closer and closer to breaking as you move through each week. It's not until you give yourself a period of rest and recovery and regeneration, which can be a deload or starting a new training cycle, that in the next 1 to 2 to 3 weeks, that's when we actually get all the gains. So it is a really important training tool that I think is very overlooked in CrossFit. I think most of us, when it comes to deloads, we deload when we feel like we have to deload, like what we call a forced deload. And if we haven't had forced deloads, unfortunately, it's a little bit too late. So what we like to do is have what we call planned or scheduled deloads throughout the year, communicate to our people when we're going to be doing it and why we're doing it, so that we can just keep the needle moving forward without dealing with things like injuries, niggles, and burnouts. The last thing is the taper. Taper is basically the period of time just before we compete, where we pull back on intensity and or volume, so allow our athletes to just kind of get that recovery, regeneration, and be ready to rock and roll for the competition. So I wanted to talk about those different cycles because it's going to be important when we actually get into, how we're going to attack the next 12 months. Last thing, in terms of those training cycles, training phases that we just talked about, how much time do we spend in each of those? Have a look at this little table here. Generally speaking, we spend more time in our year doing accumulation work. So remember what that was: slightly lower intensity, slightly lower volume, a little bit more focus on health and regeneration, building our foundations. Because the reason we spend the most amount of time there is that that's really what's going to allow us to do this season after season, year after year, without taking on things like burnout and injuries and niggles. From there, the next most important thing is intensification. So we do have to be doing kind of intense bouts throughout the year. I just want to kind of paint this picture because it's when we look at the next 12 months or 12 months of a training cycle, it's not like we just do all of our accumulation work first and then we do all of our intensification, then we do all of our pre-comp. That is one method of programming that you can use, but instead what we typically do, we kind of bounce back and forth between accumulation and intensification phases. Generally speaking, an accumulation phase might be, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks. An intensification phase might be 4 to 6 weeks, a little bit less. But we bounce back and forth between those two. Then we get to a competition like the Open, we go into a pre-comp phase, and then we compete, and then we just repeat that whole cycle over and again. Okay, let's talk about how we're going to attack the next 12 months. Before I do that, have we had any questions come through? No questions. That must be because I'm just crushing it and people can't come up with anything. That's all good. Remember, guys, if you do have any questions, feel free to chuck them in below and I can respond to them. Okay, awesome. Okay, so how do we make the 2025 season our best CrossFit season? My laptop has now been stolen. 2.0. Crucial moment right now. Videographer has just stolen my laptop, guys.
A little bit bigger for you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so here's what we have, guys. When we finish the training year, the first thing we do is we review our previous training year. What did we do well? What didn't we do well? What are we going to change? And then what we do, we basically look at the next from a week by week. We basically go, okay, week 1 of the new season, all the way down on a spreadsheet to the CrossFit Open and the quarterfinals. And what we then do is we take those training phases, the training cycles that I just taught you guys through, and we basically map those out. We insert them into those 12 months in some form of a logical progression. As a general rule, remember, as the year is moving on, our training needs to look more and more like the sport. So our training needs to look more and more like the tests and the movements we might see in the Open and quarterfinals. That's a general rule of thumb. The second general rule of thumb is the further away from competition, the more our training needs to focus on health. The closer we get to competition, the more our training needs to focus on performance. Now, in terms of my philosophy and what I believe in is, even though we're trying to improve performance the closer we get to competition, I don't really want to do that by sacrificing health at the same time. Very few of us are professional athletes where this is our absolute livelihood. And so I want to keep that in mind to make sure that, we can still enjoy life after CrossFit or whilst we're doing it. That's just something I personally believe in. So this is what we have here, guys. This table basically shows the kind of 9 phases that we have throughout the year and as we move through the whole year. So I'm going to quickly touch on just what this looks like as we move through it. So our next cycle, which is starting next Monday, 29th of May, we're focusing on developing strength, strict gymnastics, building our aerobic base. It's going to be an 8-week accumulation phase. I'll talk about what that's going to look like at the end of this presentation. After that 8-week accumulation phase, we move into a 6-week intensification phase. So remember, trainings get a little bit heavier. In this cycle, we're going to focus a little bit more on the Olympic lifts. So if you think about this, in the very first cycle, we are still going to Olympic lift, but it's going to be a little bit more focused on technique and maintenance work with the goal of bringing up strength and things like our squats, our deadlifts, our presses, and our pulls, our slower strength movements. And then in our next cycle, once we've built that big strength base, we can then go into an Olympic lifting cycle where that becomes a bit more of the priority. And then we pair the strength and the power together, strength and the speed together. And that's exactly what Olympic lifting is. We'll take some of the gymnastics movements that we isolated a bit more. So in our first cycle, focusing a bit more on developing like pulling and pushing strength. Then we're going to start to focus a bit more on developing kipping capacity and endurance. And generally speaking, our metcons are going to become a little bit more intense in this intensification cycle. And then after that, we're going to move back to an accumulation cycle. So we're going to go back and we're going to revisit. Got a bit of a spelling mistake there. We're going to revisit some of the, my order. No, that's right. I'm going to revisit some of the strength that we touched on in the very first cycle. But it's not going to be going back to the first cycle. It's going to be going back to similar things as the first cycle, but it's going to be a little bit more intense than the first cycle. Then we're moving on. I realized I got this order wrong. That was a problem. Okay, cool. So now we are into, that was what we meant to do, our accumulation cycle. Okay, from there, moving into a new six-week intensification cycle. So we've gone accumulation, intensification, accumulation, intensification. Now, again, we're going back to Olympic lifting, but this time our Olympic lifts are going to be challenged under more fatigue. Okay, so rather than just doing snatch and clean and jerk, it might be repetitive snatches combined with gymnastics or monostructural exercise. Again, that's been a big learning from this year's Open. Our gymnastics that we've worked by this point in time, 8 plus 8 is 16 plus 6, 22 weeks of isolating our gymnastics a little bit more and doing our gymnastics on the lower levels of fatigue. We're now going to really throw them into the mixer and see if we can express good technique and efficiency under higher levels of fatigue. And then we're into that January window. This is where our programs start to split a little bit because remember, our compete and elite programs, they're peaking for the quarterfinals and semis. Live and perform are preparing for the Open. So, but this is where next year, January is where we're going to start to crank things up a little bit more, especially putting a bit more focus on our metabolic conditioning with our training. And then from there, after that intensification phase, think about, just imagine the athlete now. He's done all this foundation building, built all this strength, built all these aerobic bases. Now things are getting a little bit more intense. Now we're rolling into February, end of Feb, only a few weeks out before the CrossFit Open. This is where we enter our comp prep phase. And this is where our training really starts to look like the Open and the quarterfinals. So this is the training which should be, throughout the entire year, the hardest training that we do. It's the most intense. Our body is now leaning a little bit away from health and focusing a little bit more on performance. And we're trying to get every last inch of energy and performance out of the body. And then we move into the final little touches, that last 3 weeks where we're just fine-tuning now. And then we compete in the CrossFit Open and the quarterfinals. So if I just go back there for a second, guys, that is what our 12 months is going to look like. It's a rough skeleton that we can now that we've laid that all out, we don't know what things like exercise selection, reps, sets, all that kind of stuff. We don't really know about that just yet, but we know when we get there, we have a rough idea as to what we should be doing at that point in time. Okay, now just to finish off, I want to quickly talk about what this next training cycle is going to look like, because this next cycle is starting in just a few days, guys. Next Monday, we are starting an 8-week accumulation cycle. And here's what we're going to have as our testing priorities within our 4 groups. For Live and Perform and Compete, these guys are training between 60 to 90 minutes a day. They're not doing double sessions. So because we're not doing double sessions, we have less training frequency throughout the week. So that means our testing priorities have to be a little bit smaller. As you can see, our Live, Perform, Compete programs are all going to be building towards some absolute strength tests. Live is going to be the 6 rep max back squat and a 5 rep max bench press at the end of the cycle. Perform and Compete are going to do a 5 RM back squat and a 3 RM bench press. Now, the reason the reps are a bit different is because, generally speaking, the training age of our Live athletes is a little bit younger, they're a little bit newer to strength training, so they get better responses with their strength training with a higher rep schemes. Whereas Perform, Compete, a little bit more advanced, a little bit more experienced, we can definitely explore lower rep ranges. We're not doing 1 rep maxes yet. Those will come in later intensification and accumulation phases in the year. For our elite program, these are the guys and girls training 5 days a week, maybe 6, doing multiple sessions a day. Because they got more sessions within a week, we can afford to give them more testing priorities. So they are also going to be building to a back squat, 5 RM and a bench press, 3 RM. But we also wanted to incorporate an aerobic test for these guys. We wanted to pick an aerobic test that was a little bit longer because, in the nature of an accumulation phase, we should be doing longer pieces. So we picked the C2 triathlon as our aerobic test. So in week 8 of this next cycle, we are going to be doing the C2 triathlon. And we're going to be doing a fun 8-week progression, which we've already written out to prepare athletes for that. And the cool thing about doing benchmark workouts that have been done in competitions is got loads of data on that already. So we can compare that data to where we're at and know if it's something that we need to work more on. We're almost there, team. Okay, so here is a quick overview of what this now looks like. So this table shows the Live, Perform, and Compete programs, and basically what we're going to be doing on each of our training days. So rather than me talking through this, you guys can pause this. You guys can have a little read of this. If you know which program you're following, or you're thinking about joining the process, you can have a look and see what that week looks like. Now, you'll see within each of these programs, so let's say Live, Perform, and Compete, you'll see this kind of like small dotted line halfway. The reason being is that we are implementing an A/B template for the next 8 weeks. What that means, it means that over the next 8 weeks, every other week, our training is going to alternate and change slightly. This is a really great way for us to still have structure within our training program, but it allows us to have a little bit more variety with our training. So if we have a look at, let's say, Monday on the Compete program that I'm looking at here, on the A templates, that's weeks 1, 3, 5, and 7. They are doing snatching to start. Then they're going to go into their back squat training. Then they're going to do some horizontal pulling, absolute strength work, and then they're going to do some midline conditioning. But on week 2, or that B template, weeks 2, 4, 6, and 8, they're going to do power cleans and jerks to start. They're going to go into their back squats once again. There's the structure we talked about. Then they're going to do some overhead pressing strength, and then they're going to do a short, hard, fast metcon. So we love A/B templates. It allows us to have a little bit more variety, which is really important, especially when we're doing things like 8-week training cycles. Let's look at the elite program. Same thing. Obviously, these guys and girls have AM and PM sessions 5 days a week. So we got way more training opportunities, which means we get even more variation in the training program. It allows us to work on things that maybe the Live Perform Compete program don't have the time to do, just because time being a limitation. So again, if you're in the elite program, which means you're prepping for the quarterfinals and or the semifinals, and you have the ability to train multiple times a day, you can pause this and have a little look at what our next 8 weeks is going to look like. Guys, we are at the end of our presentation. I just wanted to finish by saying that if you are a part of the Process Programming, we are very, very much looking forward to doing another year with you. Thank you so much for all your love, trust, and support. Pretty damn cool that we had 101 athletes make it to the quarterfinals this year. And we've had 12 athletes progress to the semifinals. So thank you all, whether you're an affiliate or an online subscriber, for being a part of the process last year. We really hope that you stick with us next year. I'm going to make this year even better than any year that we've done. If you're not a part of the process and you're interested in being a part of it, of course, you can join any of our amazing affiliates that we have scattered around Asia and the world, and be a part of, an in-person live community there, where we have, hands down some of the best coaches now that we've launched our individual and group class coaching courses, which is just upholding and driving the levels of coaching. Or, of course, you can be an online subscriber. Remember, we have 2 programs. We have the premium subscription, where you have a coach work with you along the way, or you can sign up to our regular subscription, where you are kind of self-accountable, taking yourself to the training. You still get to be a part of our amazing communities, have access to our chat forums, and get all the educational posts that we put out every single week, have all the leaderboards and all that good stuff. If you're interested in joining the process, we do have a 7-day free trial, and we would absolutely love to have you. Alex, do we have any questions that have come through?
At the current moment, lots of thank yous to Ed and Team Process. Yeah, that's about it. Anything else you want to say?
Not really. Other than, guys, if you have liked the YouTube live, again, I want to apologize for the slightly rocky start. Myself and Al were trying our best. I will take more responsibility than him for not excusing on that. But if you guys like this and think this is a better option for us to move forward in terms of connecting and educating with you guys than Zoom calls, or if you like the Zoom calls, you missed them, we're totally down to whatever you guys think is best. This recording will be up there to watch whenever you guys want. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. We still absolutely love what we do, and we can't wait to keep on doing it with you guys. Until next time. Now I don't know how to stop this YouTube live, so Al, help me.
Where are you going to go? You can end it when you want.
Okay, guys. Until next time.